So the second type of calibration, the more detailed calibration, is this electroacoustical calibration. This is as I've told earlier, is performed at least annually, and is required by often state and federal regulations to be performed periodically. Um, and the intent of this calibration is to meet certain standards and meet the audiological equipment to meet certain standards. And the most recent standard that the calibrations, the present day calibrations need to meet is that of 2004, particularly the standard S3.6 from the American National Standards Institute. Again, a word of precaution that when an audiometer is calibrated, the audiometer with a particular set of headphone or insert earphone and bone vibrators calibrated. So they calibrated as a unit. So although it might be the same company, the same version number, it's important that one doesn't swap the headphones. So because a headphone might be slightly off, but one would calibrate the audiometer to account for that variation in the headphone. So you have this very calibrated fixed output. Again, it's also important that immediately after the annual calibration, you set this biological calibration standards. So in that way, you can for your daily calibration, you'll have something to confirm on a daily basis. Okay, so what are these standards? So standards are pretty much written documents that are developed and confirmed by committees of experts who are known or who for that particular field. So in the case of audiologists, that would include, of course, audiologists and researchers and engineers and acousticians. So these standards would have terms, definitions of those terms, and specifications of how to measure and the performance characteristics. And it's usually developed as a public service for consumers and with the intention of maintaining uniformity among users, not only for within the clinics, but across clinics in the country and even internationally. So the present standards are by the American National Standards Institute, which again is a voluntary organization that draws support from manufacturers, professional organizations. So in our case, it actually takes volunteers from the American Speech and Hearing Association. And there's 4 standards that particularly fall within our domain, namely S1, S2, S3, S4, S12, which deal with acoustics, mechanical vibration and shock, bioacoustics, and noise. So every 5 years we have working groups that are maintained, and these are the group of individuals that review the standards. So they came up initially with the standards, and periodically they review them to either reaffirm them. So in some cases they might revise, or if it's more it's really old and not of relevance today, they might withdraw that particular standard. So we've had these standards from 1969. And as I said, they recently did one in 2010, but most of the standards just reaffirmed those from 2004. Standards are also developed in conjunction with international organizations, namely the ISO and the IEC. So in that way, we are promoting international uniformity while testing. So before we go any further into calibration, it's kind of important to have a rudimentary idea of what a clinical audiometer has. So the basic components of an audiometer include these. So you need to have a signal and a noise source. So you need to have an oscillator, which is a kind of a device that produces pure tones of different frequencies. And then you need pretty much most audiometers have a white noise source from which you can filter and make different desirable narrowband noises and broadband noises. You need provisions to accommodate external signals, like playing a signal from a CD player, like what you do for your word recognition test. Or nowadays, you can usually have it connected to a PC or a computer and run material from the computer also. You need means of controlling the duration and the intensity of the signal, and you need a means of selecting where you want the output to go, which transducer you want to provide the output, be it a loudspeaker, or an insert earphone, or a bone vibrator, or a supra earphone. So the standards set forth by ANSI has a number of different areas, including electrical safety, warm-up time, variation, power supply. Is there any distortion? Also generating unwanted signals. What kind of subject response system does it have? What is a loudspeaker system, talkback system, and such. But the main components that are typically are performed in this annual calibration, our semi-annual calibrations, essentially deals with three different aspects of the signal, namely the frequency, the intensity, and the time. The other aspects that the standard requires are usually met by the manufacturer, and there's usually no untowards. Typically, the equipment are pretty sturdy that way. And the reasoning is that if there's anything unusually affecting those other standards, it's going to be reflected as changes as a distortion of the signal, which our annual calibrations verify anyway. Since the hearing level scale for pure tones is the universal scales, so again we follow those international standards of ISO and IEC. So for the most part of this annual calibration, one would be working with a calibrated microphone. So again, microphone is a kind of transducer, and again, transducers are devices that convert one form of energy to another form. So in this case, microphones convert acoustical energy into electrical energy, which then is read by a sound level meter, and so the main aspect of this microphone would be knowing the relationship between the input to the microphone and the output of the microphone. So in this case, acoustics to electricity, and that measure is what we call as sensitivity, and it's reported as how much millivolts for every Pascal change, and of course that would be the foundation of your sound measurement. So because if you know this sensitivity, then the output of the microphone would be able to accurately reflect the amplitude of the sound, so which in this case would be in pascals. So in that way, a sound level meter is but a sophisticated voltmeter. So it essentially measures the voltage output from the microphone. And many of you guys would have been acquainted with a voltmeter. Many of them look like black boxes with usually two prongs, a red and a black, and often we use that in sockets to know whether there's any power. But the difference between that, those few dollars voltmeter that you might get in any store, and the sound level meter, of course, is the precision on which it does this measurement. So a sound level meter is an instrument designed to respond to sound approximately the same way as a human ear does, and it does so with precision, giving an objective, reproducible measurement. So there are many different types of sound level meters. This version and the one below here are those analog ones, which were being used for a long time. They are quite huge, they're bulky, and in a way they're very susceptible to damage also, and they're very expensive also. But nowadays you get much smaller versions of the sound level meter because everything is moved to digital. And the advantages of a digital is that, of course, not only the size, it's easily updatable. It's multifunctioning. While in the previous versions of the sound level meter, you need to add different components. Like for instance, this would be a component that's added to make the sound level meter analyze different frequency bands. While in the digital version of that, that would be just using a software algorithm, just like Audacity, for instance, to do the same purpose of filtering and measuring the output of the sound. And also, since it's digital and doesn't require a very large number of sophisticated precision components in it, it doesn't vary much in terms of its own calibration, so it's easier to maintain that way. And also, as time passes, they would also become lesser expensive. So essentially, the sound, any of the sound level meter systems will have three components in it. It would have a microphone, of course, to measure the sound, environmental sound, or the sound from the transducer, and then it needs a processing station to convert, for instance, the sound pressure level into its decibel equivalent, or in some cases even doing filtering and selectively weighing different filter outputs. And then it needs a readout unit, which can be like a digital display, or it could be like a needle display over here in those older analog sound level meters. So again, sound level meters would include a microphone, an internal microphone or preamplifier in some cases. Other components within the processing unit can be sensitivity controls, it could be filters, weighing networks, like the dBA, B, and C networks that we talked about. Then, of course, it needs decibel calculators to convert the micropascals, pardon me, to dBSPL or other dB calculations. Then, of course, it needs circuits to prepare the display. And sometimes you might see a meter movement or numerical panel to display the results. So that way, sound level meters are just specialized voltmeters. So here's a schematic illustration of the different components of a sound level meter. So at this end, we have the microphone. So at times when you're using a long microphone stem, to make sure that the power does not decrease significantly by the time it's being processed, you might use a preamplifier to just amplify the output of this microphone signal so it can be read by these processing units. So you have an overload detector in case if it's extremely loud, you want to protect the sensitive mechanisms after that. You might have those weighing networks, and you can recognize these as those like the A, B, and C. To get a one number estimate of the overall amplitude of a sound, or you might engage filters like you would when you're doing actually audiometric calibration. And then you'd use the filters to target just the information in one filter band. So, for instance, if you're calibrating 1,000 hertz pure tone, then you would want to choose an appropriate filter. So you're selectively looking at the energy only within that around that 1,000 hertz that you're interested in calibrating. Then you might have another amplifier prior to the display unit. Sometimes if you wanted to estimate the root mean square, then you want to have a root mean square detector. And then when you're engaging the root mean square detector, you need to define whether you want to do it and at different time constants. We'll talk about this a little bit later. Whether you want to you want to look at the fast components or the slow components, namely the F and S components within the signal. Then you might have a hold circuit. So if it's a very fluctuating signal, so it doesn't keep the numerical display doesn't quite change rapidly. You want for it to just hold a certain value. And most often that will be like the peak value within a certain amount of time to display. And then of course you'll have this display unit showing you what the recorded amplitude is. Okay. So one of the components of the sound level meter would be these weighing networks. So we talked about this earlier. So weighing networks include the dBA, B, and C. Again, these were essentially filters that are used with the intent of simulating the filtering responses of the normal human auditory system. So they are set at different loudness levels, namely 40 dB for the dBA, 70 dB for the B, 100 dB for the dBc weighing scale. Again, so you can choose to engage any of these filters, and then the output of the sound level meter would be namely dBA, B, or C, depending upon which filter that you engage. When one is doing audiometric calibration, you would want to choose the linear setting because you don't want to filter any of the frequency responses. You need to look at the linear auditory system. So in the linear setting, there would be no filtering. So that's why it's lining up at the 0 over here. So in a sense, it treats all the frequencies the same way, because now you want to look at the dBSPL scale, which is influenced by frequency in the auditory system, and that is the scale that you use for audiometric calibration. So this slide actually shows you what we call as the frequency response of a microphone. So there's different microphones that needs to be used with the sound level meter. Of course, one would have to select a microphone that is of high precision and also having a flat frequency response. In other words, the microphone itself should not filter or amplify the sound, the frequencies of the sound that it's measuring. So we'll go into detail with microphones in a different lecture, but here you can see this is the filter response, filter characteristics of a microphone chart. So you got frequencies in your x-axis, and you're looking at if there is any attenuation in amplitude on your y-axis. And you can see for most purposes this microphone has a flat response, so it just tells us that it does not influence the frequencies, at least up to 2 kilohertz. And then even after that also, it's just a minor minus 1 or 2 dB up to like almost 5 kilohertz or 8 kilohertz over here. So again, the processing section has internal and external filters. External filters can be switched in, and as I said, will help reducing the environmental noise outside the band of interest. So when one is calibrating 1000 hertz, you don't want any humming noise from the light or noise from the HVAC system to influence your calibration. So it would be wise to use the 1000 hertz filter in your sound level meter, so your readings are not influenced by this those energy and the frequencies outside the 1000 hertz that you're testing in. So the frequency range of the sounds from 20 to 20 kilohertz are actually divided into sections by these filters, which are electronic in nature. And usually, again, when you're having filters, you either specify them as 1 octave or 1/3 octave. The most prevalent manufacturers that make sound level meters is this company, just German company, Brüel and Carr. And it was kind of the golden standard to use. They're very expensive sound level meters, but they consider it as the golden standard for precision calibration, especially for audiological equipment. So the B and K sound level meters, for instance, have 11 octave filters that are engaged depending upon the frequency that you're testing. Just a word of advice: if you're testing any inter-octave frequencies like 750 hertz, 1.5, 3, or 6 kilohertz, then one would use the next highest filter. So in that way, you're not underestimating the calibration value. Okay. So you'll notice that you'll have a reduced level if you're using the incorrect filter, and that becomes especially important when you had those analog sound level meters, where you have to physically change the external filter to the frequency that you're testing in. Nowadays, with the digital sound level meter, it automatically shifts to the appropriate frequency that you're testing in. Okay. So here's an illustration of the external filters that's used in B and K sound level meter. As I said, there's about 11 of them, and they're often overlapping in terms of their bandwidth with each other. So any given frequency has an octave filter. Like for instance, you've got one for all the way from 20 hertz to in composers up to 20,000 hertz and further. Okay. So as you notice that this is a scale in the logarithmic, the frequency scale is logarithmic in nature. So what that does is the lower filters actually has they cover a more narrower range of frequencies, while the higher frequency filters actually cover a larger frequencies, and that is justifiable because apparently that is how research has shown that the human auditory system responds to frequencies, where our resolution for lower frequencies is more finer. As you go to the higher frequencies, our resolution seems to be in a logarithmic fashion. So this is another flow chart showing you the different components in the sound level meter, and importantly, the display of all the narrowband filters were engaged over here. So in this case, these are 1/3 octave filters all the way up to 8 kilohertz. And this is a newer B&K digital sound level meter that actually permits us to do even more finer analysis of the sound. So if you were recording, and I would assume this is something like a wideband noise or speech, so you can see energy across a wide range of frequencies. And in this case, the display also shows you the linear average decibel value and the dBA amplitude also. And you can see, based on this difference, you probably can estimate there's a lot more energy at the lower frequencies, and you can see that over here. There is some high amplitude at the lower frequencies, which probably is not heard as loud as they are over here by the human auditory system. So they're given less weightage in this dBA scale. Hence the difference between the dBA output and the linear output over here. So going a little bit into psychoacoustics in a way, how the human auditory system responds to sounds. And this is important to justify why we are studying sounds as is narrowband filter outputs by the sound level meter. So many researchers have shown that humans actually respond to sounds in the form of critical bands. So a critical band is the smallest band of frequencies that activate the same part of the basilar membrane. So the earlier experiments have shown that critical bands are much narrower at lower frequencies than at higher frequencies. And so majority of the critical bands, in fact 3/4 of the critical bands, are below 5,000 hertz. So critical bands are kind of analogous to spectrum analyzers with variable center frequencies. And any tone will create a critical band centered around it. Okay. So it can be explained in a different way. Critical bands cannot be when two sounds of equal loudness are sounded separately, but they're close together in pitch. The combined loudness when sounded together will be only slightly louder than any one of them. Okay, so that says that if there's two frequencies that falls within a critical band, they would not be heard as twice as loud, because both of those signals fall within that summable region of the basilar membrane. So they would not be as loud as double if they were to be sounded independently. Okay. So if these two sounds were widely separated in pitch, the perceived loudness of the combined tones will be actually considerably greater, because now they do not overlap on the basilar membrane or compete for the same hair cells. So in other words, if these tones are not within the same critical band, the combined sound may be perceived as twice as loud as one alone. And this is an important theory for auditory concept, because now it shows that the ear discriminates between energy in the band and energy that's beyond the band, that's away from the band. Okay. So critical band's width, as I said, is more wider for relatively for higher frequencies. So for below 500 hertz, the bandwidths are constant, say about 100 hertz, but above 500 hertz, it's consistently about 20% larger than the band below. And each band is estimated, at least for an adult cochlea, to be of the width of 1.3 millimeters. So hence the reasoning behind sound level meters measuring sound as a set of bandpass filters of bandwidths that are set in a logarithmic fashion, because such seems to be the way that the human auditory system responds to frequencies. Okay, so let's say this is an illustration of a critical band over here. So you've got frequency over here, and let's say this is the critical band for around 2 kilohertz. And this is the spectral level. So the critical band would refer to this frequency bandwidth surrounding this main frequency of 2 kilohertz. So if I were to place some masking, so I'm playing this 2 kilohertz sound, and then I'm also simultaneously presenting a masking noise whose bandwidth I'm continuously increasing. So let's say this masking noise bandwidth I'm increasing from 50 hertz to 100, 200, 400, and so on. And the y-axis would be the threshold for this 2 kilohertz. Let's say when I began the experiment finding the threshold, it was around 71 dBSPL when the bandwidth is 50 hertz. In other words, the bandwidth would be the width of this noise surrounding that you're giving simultaneously along with the pure tone. So when I changed the bandwidth from 50 to 100, of course there's going to be more masking, because from 50 to 100 it still is falling within this critical bandwidth. So that's going to mask the tone and increase the threshold in a linear way. And again, if I move from 100 to 200 hertz, again, if I move the bandwidth from 100 to 200 hertz, there's going to be more masking, so shifting the threshold again in the higher. But at one point, so in this case it's around 20%, 20% of 2000 hertz, so which was 400 hertz over here, you've reached the critical bandwidth. So in other words, you've engaged the whole critical bandwidth. and any increase in the bandwidth of the noise after that is not going to result in changing the masking of this pure tone. So if I change from 400 hertz to 800 hertz, for instance, it might make the signal louder, but it would not change the threshold of the signal that you're masking. So that would help you estimate what the critical bandwidth is. In this case, for 2 kilohertz, it's 400 hertz. So that's the point at which there's no further increase of the threshold, and that would be the point where you have this critical bandwidth. And again, as you shift the frequency from 2 kilohertz to 4 kilohertz, this bandwidth will proportionally widen up to, say, 800 hertz. If it was 4 kilohertz, again, 20% of that. So the take-home message is that it kind of highlights why we're using narrowband noises when we're doing pure tone masking, because now there's no point in giving a broadband noise, which is just will be loud, while effectively you could mask with a narrowband noise around the frequency that you're testing, because according to the critical band, the concept, any energy in the frequencies beyond the critical band would not serve in masking the tone within the critical band. Okay, so here is just an illustration of how the critical bands are believed to have to compose almost equal lengths of the basilar membrane. So each critical band is about 1.3 millimeter along the length of the basilar membrane. However, the frequency that it covers would be different. For instance, at the basal end, the critical bandwidth could be around 800 hertz, while as you're progressing to the apex, it'll be much narrower. It'll be 150 hertz, which kind of also plays into our the psychoacoustics of frequency discrimination, where one can discriminate closer frequencies at the lower frequency levels, let's say about 100, 200, or up to 1000, 2000 hertz. However, for higher frequencies, you need a larger difference between two tones in terms of frequency before one can discriminate it. So the other components of the sound level meter include an RMS detector. Again, you would use the output from each of those bandwidth, each of the filters, and it would do the root mean square average to get like a one park average energy of the signal that you're measuring in. Then you might have a readout unit, which is going to display in dB or the dBA or C scale, whichever one you're engaging. And many of the sound level meters also have an option of an output socket where you can output the electrical analog of the signal that you're measuring into, say, a computer if you want to do a spectrum analysis, or if you want to create a graph or print an output.